My grandfather owned land in Oklahoma. That is what his family told him. They had paperwork. They had a name on a document. What they did not have was the land. By the time my grandfather was old enough to ask questions, the land had been gone for 40 years. His grandmother could not explain exactly how it happened. She just said the men came with papers, and after that, the land was not theirs anymore. I started pulling on that thread 3 years ago. What I found is not a family story. It is a national story, and the mechanism behind it is so clean, so legally constructed, so deliberately ordinary looking that it has been sitting in federal archives for over 100 years without most Americans ever hearing about it. Here is the number that started everything for me. In 1887, Native American tribes legally controlled 138 million acres across the United States. By 1934, that number was 48 million. 90 million acres gone in 47 years. To understand how large that is, take the entire land area of Germany, add France, add the United Kingdom. That is roughly what disappeared, and not a single battle was fought to take it. No invasion, no army crossing a border, just a law, some surveyors, and paperwork filed in offices that most people never visited. The law was called the Dawes Act. Senator Henry Dawes of Massachusetts introduced it in 1887. And here is the part that makes this story harder than a simple theft. Dawes genuinely believed he was helping. His argument was straightforward. Native tribes held land communally, meaning no individual owned a specific parcel. Dawes said that was the problem. Give each family their own plot, 160 acres. Let them farm it privately. Let them build something that belonged to them. Whatever land remained after the allotments were assigned would be declared surplus and open for sale to white settlers. That word surplus is where everything broke open. The federal government sent surveyors to reservations across the country starting in 1887. Their official job was simple: measure the land, assign 160-acre allotments to qualifying tribal members, and identify what was left over. In Oklahoma, in North Dakota, in Montana, in Idaho, surveyor after surveyor arrived with measuring equipment, ledger books, and a formula that looked neutral on paper. It was not neutral. In the federal archives, original survey documents from dozens of reservations still exist. They have been sitting there for over a century. When researchers began going through them systematically in the 1990s, they found something that appears in none of the history textbooks. In multiple reservations, the same parcel of land appeared in 2 separate official documents, once as an allotment assigned to a specific native family by name, and simultaneously as surplus land, available for immediate sale to white settlers. The same acres. 2 records, 2 legal destinations. I want you to stop on that for a moment because it is easy to read past it. This was not a mistake. Surveyors did not accidentally write the same coordinates twice. The duplication required someone to sit down with 2 separate ledgers, copy the same location into both, and file them in 2 different offices. It required other people to process those documents, approve those documents, and act on those documents. Multiple human beings in a chain, each performing a routine administrative task, each moving 90 million acres, 1 signature at a time. No one was charged. No one was fired. No one lost anything, except the families whose names were on the first document while someone else was already buying the land in the second. And this was only the first layer. Because there was a second mechanism buried inside the Dawes Act, one that was even cleaner, one that used the allotments themselves as the instrument of removal. A mechanism specifically designed for the families that the surveyors had not managed to dispossess the first time around. A 4-year-old child cannot read a contract, cannot understand what oil rights mean, cannot travel to land they have never seen, cannot negotiate lease terms or question a payment figure, or ask why the number seems low. In the Bureau of Indian Affairs, records currently sitting in the National Archives in Washington, there are lease agreements for oil and mineral rights signed on behalf of children that age. Not metaphorically, literally. A government employee filled in the child's name, calculated the lease terms, accepted payment, and filed the paperwork. Correctly. Completely legally. and committed that child's land and everything underneath it for the next 30 years. This happened across hundreds of files in a single Oklahoma county alone. Here is how the system was built to make it possible. When the Dawes Act assigned allotments to Native families starting in 1887, children received allotments too. A child born into a qualifying tribe was entitled to their own 160 acres. Federal law stated that until adulthood, that land was held in trust and managed entirely by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. One government agent controlled everything: who leased it, who drilled on it, what the payments would be, where the money went. Now add the second piece. Starting in the 1880s, the federal government was simultaneously removing Native children from their reservations and placing them in boarding schools hundreds and sometimes over 1,000 miles from home. A child who received a land allotment at age 7 and was taken to a boarding school in Pennsylvania at age 10 was completely absent from their own land. During the exact years the most consequential decisions about that land were being made. The agent leased the land. The child was in Pennsylvania learning to sew. The agent accepted a drilling offer. The child was in Kansas learning English. The agent signed the paperwork. The child had never seen the paperwork. In 1905, a Creek Nation member named Jackson Barnett was assigned 160 acres of dry flat land in Oklahoma that nobody wanted. The Bureau classified him as incompetent, meaning a federal agent controlled all decisions about his property. In 1912, an oil company drilled on his land and found one of the largest deposits in Oklahoma history. Within a decade, Barnett was worth $11 million on paper. He never controlled most of it. Federal agents redirected his royalties for years. When he died in 1934, the money was almost entirely gone. Nobody went to prison. The transactions were all completely legal. Barnett's case survived because the numbers were large enough to generate court records. For every Jackson Barnett, there were 1,000 families where the amounts were smaller, the paper trail thinner, and no court ever looked twice. A woman named Rosie Deciding Crow filed a petition with Congress in 1911 describing exactly what had happened to her family's allotment in North Dakota while her children were away at school. The petition was received, logged, and filed. There is no record of a response. Her children's names are still on the original allotment document. The land has had 11 different owners since 1911. None of them share her family's name. $40,000 came out of Carrie Kinney's land in 14 months. She received $1,100. Carrie Kinney was a full-blood Creek Nation woman who owned an oil-producing allotment in Okmulgee County, Oklahoma. In 1921, a county judge reviewed her case and signed a court order declaring her legally incompetent to manage her own finances. He appointed a white attorney named W. Hastings to manage everything on her behalf. She had never met Hastings before the day the order was signed. She was not present in the courtroom when it happened. Hastings collected the royalties. Hastings negotiated the leases. Hastings decided what Carrie Kinney needed to live on and transferred the rest into accounts she could not access. When she found out what the numbers actually were and petitioned the court to remove him, the petition went back to the same judge who had appointed Hastings in the first place. He denied it without a hearing. $40,000 in, $1,100 out. Completely legal. Now, here is what makes this worse. Hastings was not unusual. In Okmulgee County alone, researchers documented dozens of attorneys operating identical arrangements simultaneously. A 1924 investigation by the Oklahoma City Times found one attorney serving as legal guardian for 31 separate Native clients at the same time. He collected management fees from every single account. He was also a partner in 2 of the companies that were leasing the land he was supposed to be protecting. He was on both sides of every transaction. The newspaper described what they found as a system so completely and carefully organized, it functioned like a business with its own courts, its own rules, and its own enforcers. The federal government received a copy of that investigation. Nothing happened. In 1927, a congressional subcommittee traveled to Oklahoma to investigate. They took testimony for 3 weeks. They heard from woman after woman who had entered the guardianship system with productive land and oil royalties and exited years later with nothing. One woman testified that her guardian had sold her mineral rights for $12 an acre. Comparable land 2 miles away was selling for over $200. She had learned about the sale 2 years after it happened. The money was already gone. The subcommittee published a 400-page report. It named specific individuals. It recommended criminal prosecution. It described the mechanism in precise detail so that nobody in Washington could claim they did not understand what had happened. Several of the men named in that report continued practicing law in Oklahoma for decades afterward. At least 2 of them were eventually appointed as judges. The report has been sitting in the National Archives since 1927. Carrie Kinney's court file is in there too. Her handwriting is on the petition she filed to remove Hastings, the petition that was denied without a hearing by the judge who appointed him. She filed it anyway. That is the part I keep coming back to. She knew the system. She had watched it work. She filed the petition anyway. Because what else do you do when someone is sitting in an office collecting your money and a court order says that is completely legal? Mollie Burkhart buried her mother in 1921, then her sister Anna, then her sister Minnie, then her sister Rita, who died in a house explosion at 3 a.m, along with her husband and a neighbor who happened to be visiting. 4 members of one family. 3 years. Mollie was the only one left. She did not yet know that her own husband was poisoning her at the dinner table every evening on instructions from his uncle. She did not know that the man who organized her sister's deaths taught Sunday school and was known across 3 Oklahoma counties as a generous friend to the Osage people. She did not know because there was no reason to suspect it. The deaths looked like illness, like accident, like the kind of misfortune that follows certain families. They were not misfortune. They were a financial strategy. When the federal government created the Osage allotment system in 1906, they included a protection that did not exist anywhere else. Every enrolled Osage member received a headright, a permanent share of all mineral royalties from Osage land. The headright could not be sold, could not be transferred, could not be taken by a guardian or a court or a creditor. It could only pass through inheritance. That one word changed everything. Under Oklahoma law at the time, when a married Osage woman died, her husband inherited her headright. When her children died, he inherited theirs. A white man who married into the right Osage family and then outlived that family did not need a guardian arrangement or a fraudulent survey or a corrupt judge. He just needed patience and a willingness to do what William Hale was willing to do. Hale was Ernest Burkhart's uncle. Ernest was Mollie's husband. Hale had spent years before the murders building relationships across Osage County, lending money, attending church, showing up at funerals, making himself indispensable to families whose deaths he was quietly planning. When investigators eventually reconstructed his financial records, they found he had positioned himself to benefit from at least 8 separate Osage deaths through a combination of direct inheritance, fraudulent insurance policies, and arrangements with other white men doing the same thing in parallel. At least 24 Osage people were confirmed murdered between 1921 and 1926. Investigators who reviewed the full case files decades later put the likely number above 60. The difference between 24 and 60 is the difference between deaths that left visible evidence and deaths that looked exactly like what Hale needed them to look like. Hale was eventually convicted. Ernest Burkhart confessed. The FBI case became the founding story of the modern Bureau. It is the version of this history that got made into a film. But here is what the film does not show you. In the same years that Hale was poisoning Mollie Burkhart's family in Osage County, the guardian system we described in the last chapter was running without interruption in every other Oklahoma county. The same transfer of wealth, the same elimination of native ownership, the same beneficiaries walking away with land and royalties they did not earn. The difference was not the outcome, the difference was the method. In Osage County, the headright protection meant paperwork alone was not enough, so some men chose poison and explosives instead. Everywhere else, paperwork was sufficient, and nobody needed to do anything that looked like a crime. Mollie Burkhart survived. She lived until 1937. In her final years, she gave several interviews describing what had happened to her family. In every interview, she said the same thing in different words. She said she had trusted the people around her because they were her neighbors and her husband and her community, and she had no reason not to. That sentence is in the historical record. It has been there since the 1930s.
480 слов. Открываю с самого болезненного факта, даю пространство вокруг ключевых цифр, Кабел как живой человек через всю главу, финал, факт, который невозможно забыть. Chapter 5. The number that doesn't change. 500,000 Native Americans received a check in 2009 from the federal government as compensation for over a century of mismanaged land accounts. The average check was less than $1,000. That is where this story ends. Not in 1887 with the surveyors, not in the 1920s with the guardians, in 2009, with a settlement that a federal court approved and a government that signed it, and 500,000 people who received an envelope in the mail with a number inside that represented everything the system we have been describing owed them across 4 generations. Less than $1,000. Here is how that number was reached. In 1996, a Blackfeet Nation member named Eloise Coble sat down in a Bureau of Indian Affairs office in Washington and asked for the accounting records on federal trust accounts that the Bureau had been managing on behalf of Native landowners since 1887. The same Bureau that had managed the allotments, the same Bureau whose agents had signed leases while children sat in boarding schools 1,000 miles from their land. She was a trained accountant. She wanted to see where the money had gone. The Bureau told her the records were incomplete. She asked how incomplete. They could not say. She asked for an audit. They said an audit was not possible because the record-keeping systems going back to the 1880s were too fragmented to reconstruct. A federal agency that had collected royalties and lease payments and mineral rights revenues on behalf of Native landowners for over 100 years could not show where the money had gone. Coble filed a class action lawsuit. It became the largest lawsuit against the federal government in American history. During the 13 years of litigation, the judge overseeing the case held the Interior Department in contempt of court twice, not once, twice, for destroying evidence, for failing to comply with court orders to produce records. A federal agency was held in contempt by a federal judge for destroying documents related to Native financial accounts, and the case still continued for another decade. The plaintiffs sued for $176 billion. The government settled for $3.4 billion. The difference is $172 billion. That is not the amount that was proven stolen. That is the amount the settlement explicitly did not require the government to explain. $172 billion closed without accounting. By agreement, with a judge's signature. Eloise Coble died in 2011. 2 years after the settlement, she had spent 15 years of her life and her own money on a lawsuit asking one question. She never received a full answer. The settlement fund was named after her. The people whose names she fought for received less than $1,000 each. Go back to Chapter 1. The surveyor with 2 ledgers, the same land in 2 separate documents, one for the Native family, one marked surplus. That was 1887. The Coble settlement was 2009. Between those 2 dates, the same Bureau of Indian Affairs managed the same accounts, collected the same royalties, filed the same paperwork, and when a federal court finally asked for the receipts, the answer was that the records were too fragmented to reconstruct. $172 billion that nobody was required to account for. That number has not changed. It is in the court record. It has been public since 2009. The question is not where it went. The question is why the number that settled the case was not the number that explained it. The Coble settlement was signed in 2009. The amount that was not required to be explained was $172 billion. That number is in the public court record. It has been there for 16 years. I want to ask you one thing before you close this video. Not to subscribe, not to like, just this. Think about the last time you heard that number mentioned anywhere, in a classroom, in a documentary, in a newspaper, on any platform you use every day. If you cannot remember, write that in the comments. Just that.
I cannot remember either, because the most telling thing about $172 billion that a federal court did not require to be explained is not that it happened. It is how completely and quietly it was forgotten. If this video is the first time you are hearing this number, that is the story, not what I told you. That